Most of what you were taught about the 1933 gold confiscation is either a comforting fairy tale or a dangerous distortion of history. The popular version goes something like this. America was mired in the depths of the Great Depression. Banks were collapsing like houses of cards, and a newly elected Franklin D. Roosevelt strode into the Oval Office, looked at a nation in freefall, and with the stroke of a single pen, issued Executive Order 6102, forcing everyday citizens to hand over their gold coins to the federal government under threat of prison. It is a clean, dramatic narrative, the decisive leader taking bold, sweeping action to save a broken economy from the clutches of hoarders and speculators. It makes for a compelling story, which is precisely why it has survived for nearly a century in textbooks and documentaries alike. But the truth is far more unsettling, because the seizure of American gold was not really born in the panic of March 1933, nor was it a spontaneous emergency measure cooked up overnight to stop a run on the banks. It was born years earlier in the suffocating ledger books of the Federal Reserve, in the secret diplomatic cables traded between Washington and European central banks, terrified of a global monetary collapse, in a rigid and dogmatic adherence to a dying international gold standard, and in a multi-year debt spiral that lawmakers and financiers spent the late 1920s desperately trying to conceal from a public that had no idea how fragile their money actually was. The real origin of the 1933 gold confiscation is a story about hidden systemic insolvency, about the terrifying mechanics of international capital flight, about legal sleight of hand disguised as war powers, and about the arrogant delusion of a financial establishment that believed it could manage its way out of a mathematical collapse without ever admitting that the system was fundamentally broken. So let me take you through what actually happened, because once you see the full picture, once you look past the myth of the tyrannical executive and examine the structural rot underneath, you will never look at money, property, or banking in the same way again. To understand why the American monetary system disintegrated so violently in the spring of 1933, you have to go back well before the Wall Street crash of 1929. You have to start with the fundamental architecture of the money itself. And that architecture had been fundamentally flawed since the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. The system was built on a paradox. It promised that every paper dollar could be freely exchanged for a fixed weight of gold, yet it simultaneously allowed for the expansion of credit and bank deposits far beyond the physical gold available in the vaults to back them. For a time, during the roaring economic expansion of the 1920s, this illusion held together through an intricate web of foreign loans, international debt rescheduling, and massive speculative bubbles. American banks were awash in liquidity, lending aggressively not just to domestic businesses and stock market speculators, but to foreign governments across Europe and South America, trying to rebuild or stabilize their own shattered economies after the First World War. But this entire edifice of prosperity was built on a knife edge. The moment foreign debtors stopped paying, or the moment confidence in the stability of the dollar wavered, the entire pyramid scheme of international credit threatened to come crashing down. And that is precisely what began to happen as the decade drew to a close. When the stock market collapsed in October 1929, it was not an isolated financial accident. It was the explosive end stage of a decade of unchecked credit expansion. Yet, in the immediate aftermath, the official narrative from Washington and Wall Street was one of calm reassurance. President Herbert Hoover and the leadership of the Federal Reserve insisted that the economy was fundamentally sound, that the crash was merely a temporary correction of speculative excesses, and that no radical intervention was necessary. This was the first great deception. Behind closed doors, central bankers knew that the nation's monetary base was rapidly eroding. As businesses failed, farm prices collapsed, and unemployment skyrocketed, ordinary citizens began doing what humans have done for millennia during times of profound uncertainty. They lost faith in paper promises and started hoarding hard assets. They wanted gold, and more importantly, they wanted to pull their money out of the banking system entirely. Now, a reasonable person might ask, if the banks were facing such severe pressure, why didn't the Federal Reserve simply let the system adjust? Or why didn't they suspend gold payments openly and honestly through legislative debate? And the answer is that the ruling financial and political establishment viewed the gold standard not merely as an economic policy, but as a sacred moral absolute. To them, abandoning or even modifying the gold standard was tantamount to national bankruptcy and moral failure. The prevailing orthodox belief was that any interference with the automatic mechanisms of gold would destroy international trade, ruin national credit, and plunge civilization into permanent barbarism. This created a fatal structural deadlock. The domestic economy was drowning in a suffocating wave of deflation. Prices were crashing, debts were becoming impossible to service because the value of every dollar was artificially rising relative to goods and wages, and thousands of local banks were failing every single month as panicked depositors demanded their funds. The obvious solution to deflation is an expansion of the money supply to ease the burden of debt. But under the rules of the gold standard, the Federal Reserve could not expand the money supply unless it acquired more gold, and gold was precisely what was flowing out of the banking system, either into the mattresses and safety deposit boxes of frightened American citizens or across the ocean to European central banks, executing massive gold runs against the United States. France, in particular, played a critical, often overlooked role in this dynamic. Having stabilized the French franc in the late 1920s by undervaluing its currency, the Bank of France began aggressively repatriating its massive dollar reserves and converting them directly into American gold. Day after day, ocean liners sailed out of New York Harbor carrying tons of American gold bullion across the Atlantic, depleting the Federal Reserve's reserves at an alarming rate. The United States was caught in a brutal crossfire. Domestic depositors were draining gold from the inside, while foreign central banks were vacuuming it up from the outside. And the political machinery in Washington was completely paralyzed. Hoover's administration clung desperately to the belief that balancing the federal budget and maintaining the gold standard at all costs would magically restore confidence. But confidence cannot be legislated into existence when people can see with their own eyes that their life savings are evaporating. By late 1931 and throughout 1932, the situation transitioned from a severe recession into a rolling financial panic. State governors began declaring mandatory bank holidays just to stop the bleeding, shutting down entire state financial systems for days or weeks at a time to prevent total collapse. This is the part of the story that most popular accounts gloss over. They jump straight from the despair of Hoover's final months to the triumphant inauguration of Franklin D. Roosevelt on March 4, 1933, as if the new president picked up a magic wand on day one. But what actually happened in the transition period was a desperate clandestine scramble by outgoing and incoming officials to figure out how to prevent a total social uprising while keeping the skeleton of the financial system from turning to dust. By the time FDR took the oath of office, the banking system of the United States was effectively dead. Entire states had no functioning banks. People were bartering with scrip, clearinghouse certificates, and postage stamps. The gold drain had accelerated to a point where the Federal Reserve was within days, perhaps hours, of exhausting its legal gold reserves entirely, which would have automatically forced a public default on the dollar. The system had hit the absolute wall of its own mathematical contradictions. And this brings us to the crucial realization that shatters the standard historical narrative. Executive Order 6102, signed on April 5, 1933, was not an act of sudden dictatorial aggression by a power-hungry executive. It was the desperate, inevitable culmination of decades of monetary mismanagement, structural cowardice, and elite refusal to admit that the gold standard had become an instrument of mass economic destruction. The state had backed itself into a corner where it could either default openly on its promise to redeem currency in gold, shattering the myth of its own fiscal infallibility, or it could criminalize the ownership of gold by its own citizens, seize the metal at an artificially depressed statutory price, and use it to backstop a shattered banking apparatus. They chose the latter. Under the authority of a World War I-era statute called the Trading with the Enemy Act, stretched and distorted beyond any recognition of its original legislative intent, Roosevelt ordered every individual, partnership, association, and corporation to deliver all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve by May 1st, 1933, in exchange for paper currency at the fixed rate of $20.67 per ounce. Those who refused faced draconian penalties, up to $10,000 in fines, up to 10 years in prison, or both. Think about the profound cynicism of that mechanism for a moment. First, the government and the central banking system engineered an economic depression through credit manipulation and policy paralysis. Then, when the public lost trust and sought safety in the one asset that could not be printed out of thin air, the state turned around, declared that same safe haven asset to be a threat to national security, forced citizens to surrender it at gunpoint under emergency powers, and less than a year later, under the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, revalued that exact same gold upward to $35 an ounce, instantly booking a massive windfall profit for the federal treasury while paying off its citizens in devalued paper. It was a masterclass in institutional expropriation, yet history books for generations taught us to view it as a heroic rescue operation. They painted the citizens who tried to hold onto their gold coins as selfish speculators standing in the way of the common good, while casting the architects of the confiscation as pragmatic saviors. The reality is that the 1933 gold confiscation was the moment the modern fiat state truly revealed its teeth. It proved that when the foundational promises of a monetary system collapse under the weight of their own systemic debt and structural contradictions, the state will not sacrifice the system to protect the property rights of the individual. It will sacrifice the individual to protect the solvency of the state. The gold didn't disappear into thin air. It was locked away in the subterranean vaults of Fort Knox, transformed from private wealth into state power, laying the absolute groundwork for the unbounded credit expansion and monetary experiments that define our financial world today. And that pattern, the quiet accumulation of structural debt, the desperate denial of systemic insolvency, the sudden invocation of emergency powers during a manufactured crisis, and the ultimate transfer of wealth from the public to the institutions that broke the system in the first place, is not a relic of 1933. It is the permanent, recurring playbook of modern finance. If this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of monetary history changed the way you think about the world around you, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next breakdown. There are more stories coming, and they are going to challenge everything you thought you knew. The financial crisis of the early 1930s was never a singular event that struck out of a clear blue sky. It was the inevitable explosion of a pressure cooker that had been heating up for over a decade. By the winter of 1932, the United States was caught in the grip of a multi-layered, cascading failure that defied every traditional economic model of the era. To understand how the situation deteriorated to the point where peacetime military legislation was weaponized against American citizens, you have to look at how different economic catastrophes collided all at once, creating a feedback loop of pure panic. At the center of this perfect storm was a brutal, self-reinforcing debt spiral. During the expansive 1920s, farmers, industrial workers, and corporations alike had borrowed heavily against future earnings, assuming that asset prices would continue their upward trajectory indefinitely. But when the credit expansion abruptly halted, commodity prices plummeted into the abyss. Wheat, cotton, and corn lost more than half their value in a matter of months, while fixed mortgage payments, local taxes, and bank debts remained stubbornly locked at their pre-crash levels. A farmer who had taken out a loan to buy acreage when wheat was selling at high prices suddenly found that he needed to harvest 3 times as much crop just to service the interest on his debt. At the exact moment weather patterns and economic depression cut his yields and revenue to the bone, this agricultural collapse acted as a slow-acting poison that worked its way up through the entire financial ecosystem. Rural banks across the Midwest and the South, which had tied their survival directly to local farm loans and land mortgages, began to implode in waves. When a small country bank in Iowa or Mississippi closed its doors, it didn't just wipe out the savings of local grocers and school teachers, it severed the credit lines connecting regional banks to the major financial clearinghouses in Chicago and New York. Panic is a contagious psychological pathogen. When depositors in neighboring towns saw their friends and family lose their life savings overnight, they didn't wait for their own bank to fail. They rushed to the teller windows to demand cash. And here is where the mechanical trap of the gold standard closed its jaws with deadly precision. Under the rules governing the monetary system, every dollar demanded by a panicked depositor had to be paid out in actual currency backed by gold or in gold coin itself. As long as the public trusted the banks, paper money circulated smoothly. But the moment trust evaporated, the banking system faced an impossible mathematical constraint. The total volume of deposits vastly exceeded the physical supply of currency and gold in existence. No bank, no matter how prudently managed, could survive a simultaneous run by all of its depositors if everyone demanded hard redemption at the same time. The Federal Reserve, which had been explicitly created in 1913 to act as a lender of last resort and prevent these exact types of banking panics, paralyzed itself through dogmatic adherence to outdated monetary theory. Instead of aggressively pumping liquidity into the collapsing system to backstop frightened depositors, central bankers obsessed over maintaining reserve ratios and protecting the gold parity of the dollar. They watched passively, and at times with active approval, believing it would purge unsound elements from the economy as thousands of banks collapsed. In their view, allowing weak institutions to fail was a necessary cleansing ritual, a harsh medicine required to restore economic health. Instead of restoring health, it nearly killed the patient. As local banks fell like dominoes, the panic escalated from regional anxiety to national hysteria. Citizens across the country began stuffing cash into mattresses, burying mason jars filled with gold coins in their backyards, or converting their dwindling paper dollars into whatever tangible commodities they could find. This mass hoarding behavior removed billions of dollars of vital liquidity from active circulation, contracting the money supply at a terrifying rate. Prices continued their downward freefall, wages were slashed to pennies, and unemployment climbed toward 25%. Factories sat idle, not because people didn't want goods, but because there was literally no medium of exchange left to buy them with. Compounding this domestic implosion was an aggressive wave of international capital flight. Foreign central banks and global investors, watching the American banking system disintegrate and fearing that the United States would ultimately be forced to devalue the dollar against gold, launched massive coordinated runs on American gold reserves. Every ship crossing the Atlantic carried millions of dollars in gold bullion away from New York and toward London, Paris, and Amsterdam. The Federal Reserve found itself trapped in an agonizing vice. Domestic depositors were draining gold from the inside out, while foreign creditors were vacuuming it up from the outside in. By the winter of 1932 and early 1933, the traditional mechanisms of governance had completely broken down. State governors, recognizing that the federal government was paralyzed by ideological gridlock and electoral transition, began taking unilateral action. Michigan declared a statewide banking holiday in mid-February 1933, shuttering every financial institution within its borders to halt a catastrophic run on Detroit banks. Within weeks, the contagion spread like wildfire. State after state announced emergency bank closures. By the first week of March, the entire American financial map was a patchwork of emergency shutdowns. Commerce ground to a complete halt. People could not buy groceries, pay rent, or collect paychecks because the plumbing of the economy had frozen solid. Yet, beneath the surface of this economic chaos, a profound legal transformation was taking place, one that weaponized emergency powers in a way the nation had never experienced during peacetime. When the Roosevelt administration assumed power in March 1933, they did not look to Congress to draft new, deliberative legislation to address the crisis. Instead, they reached into the dusty archives of World War I and pulled out the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. Originally passed during the height of the First World War to give the executive branch sweeping authority to restrict trade with hostile foreign powers and prevent capital flight to the German Empire, this statute contained broad, elastic language granting the president extraordinary powers during times of declared national emergency. The legal architects of the New Deal realized with stunning clarity that they could stretch this wartime legislation to apply not to foreign enemies across the ocean, but to American citizens at home. By simply declaring that the domestic banking crisis constituted a national emergency equivalent to a state of war, the administration bypassed the legislative branch entirely. In the opening hours of his presidency, Roosevelt invoked the amended Trading with the Enemy Act to declare a nationwide bank holiday, freezing the entire financial system under executive decree. This was not merely a temporary pause to catch a breath. It was a fundamental shift in the balance of constitutional power. It established the dangerous precedent that a peacetime economic downturn could be treated as an existential military threat, justifying the immediate suspension of normal legal protections and property rights. The psychological climate created by this militarization of economic policy was suffocating. The public, desperate for leadership and terrified by the total collapse of daily commerce, welcomed the decisive action, completely unaware of the long-term constitutional and financial implications. When the emergency bank holiday was instituted, citizens were ordered not to question the suspension of their access to their own deposits, but to view it as a patriotic sacrifice necessary to save the nation. Behind the closed doors of the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve, officials understood that simply reopening the banks without solving the underlying gold drain would trigger an immediate, terminal second wave of runs. The vaults would be emptied of their remaining gold within 48 hours, forcing an involuntary, chaotic default on the international stage. The only way to prevent this was to cut off the escape hatch available to ordinary citizens. The government had to ensure that when the banks finally reopened, depositors could not demand redemption in gold coin. This required criminalizing the private ownership of monetary gold. The panic was no longer viewed by the establishment as a failure of policy, but as a crisis driven by the hoarding behavior of distrustful citizens. By reframing the individual desire to protect one's savings as a subversive act, undermining national recovery, the state manufactured the moral justification for mass expropriation. The stage was set for Executive Order 6102, a decree that would treat American savers not as clients of a broken financial system, but as adversaries of the state. The ink on Executive Order 6102 had barely dried before the true mechanism of enforcement began to play out across the country. revealing a chilling reality about the relationship between the individual, private property, and the modern state. Signed on April 5th, 1933, the decree did not arrive with the dramatic theater of federal agents kicking down doors in the dead of night. Instead, it relied on a quieter, far more insidious form of social compliance backed by the implicit threat of total ruin. Citizens were given until May 1st to march down to their local banks and Federal Reserve branches, hand over their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates, and exchange them for paper currency at the rigid statutory rate of $20.67 per ounce. For the average American, the choice was stark and terrifying. The penalty for non-compliance was draconian, a fine of up to $10,000, a prison sentence of up to 10 years, or both. In an era where millions were already struggling just to put food on the table, the prospect of a federal felony conviction and financial annihilation was more than enough to ensure mass submission. People dug into dresser drawers, opened dusty family lock boxes, and surrendered gold pieces that had been passed down through generations as a hedge against disaster. They did so because the state had successfully framed compliance as the ultimate patriotic duty, casting anyone who held on to their metal as a selfish speculator sabotaging the national recovery. Yet, beneath the surface compliance, pockets of quiet resistance and profound legal anxiety emerged. Numismatists, small business owners, and independent savers scrambled to understand the vague definitions within the order, particularly the exemption that allowed individuals to keep up to $100 in gold coin for customary use in art, profession, or industry, or rare and uncirculated coins of recognized special value. Law firms were flooded with frantic inquiries from clients trying to decipher whether their family keepsakes or small savings caches qualified for exemption or marked them as criminals. But the federal government left little room for ambiguity in practice. Treasury officials made it clear that the broad intent of the law was absolute. Private monetary gold was to be eradicated from circulation and centralized within the vaults of the state. What followed this massive domestic expropriation was one of the most calculated financial maneuvers in modern history, a maneuver that exposed the breathtaking hypocrisy at the heart of the crisis management strategy. Once the government had successfully gathered up the nation's privately held gold at the depressed rate of $20.67 an ounce and locked it away under heavy guard, the stage was set for the second act. In January 1934, Congress passed the Gold Reserve Act, officially ratifying what the executive branch had engineered behind closed doors. By presidential proclamation, the official value of gold was abruptly revalued upward to $35 an ounce. Think about the sheer audacity of that transformation for a moment. Just months earlier, ordinary citizens were forced to surrender their gold to the government under threat of a 10-year prison sentence, receiving paper currency valued at the old depressed standard. The moment that gold was safely consolidated in the hands of the federal treasury, the government instantly increased its value by nearly 70%. The state booked an astronomical, instantaneous paper profit on the backs of its own people while using that newly inflated valuation to backstop a shattered banking system and paper over decades of systemic fiscal recklessness. The citizen was paid off in devalued paper. The state harvested the windfall. The legal fiction that sustained this entire operation was breathtaking. Courts that were asked to challenge the constitutionality of the gold seizures routinely folded under the pressure of the national emergency, ruling that the federal government's plenary power over the currency superseded individual property rights. The sacred contract between the citizen and the state, the implicit promise that private property was inviolable and that paper money represented a reliable, honest claim on hard assets, was rewritten overnight. It marked the definitive birth of the modern fiat era in the United States, an era where money derived its value not from a fixed, immutable weight of metal that the citizen could freely hold and defend, but entirely from the unchallengeable decree of the sovereign authority. And the psychological fallout of this transformation left a permanent scar on the American consciousness. A whole generation learned a bitter, unspoken lesson. When the financial system breaks under the weight of its own debt, the rules of property ownership change instantly to protect the institutions at the top. The safety deposit box, once viewed as an absolute sanctuary of private wealth, was revealed to be vulnerable to the stroke of an executive pen. Trust in the integrity of the monetary system did not return because people felt secure. It returned because people had no alternative. The dollar was the only game in town, backed no longer by gold coins in the pocket of the worker, but by the coercive police power of the federal government. Yet, the true significance of the 1933 gold confiscation extends far beyond the historical confines of the Great Depression. The structural anatomy of that crisis, the hidden accumulation of unsustainable debt, the frantic denial of systemic insolvency by central bankers, the sudden invocation of emergency wartime powers during a domestic economic collapse, and the ultimate transfer of wealth from the public to the state is not a relic of the past. It is the permanent, recurring blueprint of modern financial governance. Whenever debt spirals out of control, whenever asset bubbles burst, and whenever the fragile scaffolding of global credit begins to shudder under its own weight, the modern state reaches for the exact same playbook. The terminology changes, the digital instruments replace the physical gold coins, and the justifications are dressed up in the sophisticated jargon of modern monetary theory or systemic risk management, but the core dynamic remains identical. When the math no longer works, the rules are rewritten. When the system faces a terminal reckoning, the individual's right to financial autonomy is quietly subordinated to the survival of the institution. The story of 1933 is ultimately a warning about the fragility of systems built on debt and deception. It teaches us that institutions will never voluntarily admit their own insolvency. They will always choose to expand their power, restrict private liberties, and redefine legality to protect their own survival. The gold didn't vanish into thin air. It was simply consolidated into monuments of state power like Fort Knox, serving as a silent reminder of what happens when a society pushes the illusions of credit further than reality can bear. And as you look at the architecture of the financial world today, with its mounting sovereign debts, its endless cycles of monetary expansion, its weaponized banking infrastructure, and its growing hostility toward decentralized, independent forms of value, you realize that we are living through the modern echoes of that exact same story. The characters have changed, the technology is different, but the fundamental pressure cooker is heating up along the exact same lines. History may not repeat itself word for word, but it rhymes with terrifying precision for those who take the time to listen to the ledger books of the past. If this deep dive into the hidden architecture of monetary history changed the way you look at the world around you, do me a favor and hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. I have got more stories like this coming, and I promise you they are going to challenge everything you thought you knew about the systems we live under. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.